Hey, hello, Mike.
How are you?
Great, man. Thank you for
How's
coming
the
on.
audio?
Audio sounds great. You're the
Perfect.
first. You're one of the first ones I've had that hasn't had issues right away. Like they'll come on and I'll see them talking, but I can't hear them. Yeah, you're perfect.
Awesome. Yeah, I switched. I went to headphones yesterday, and it seems to work better. So I'm sticking with it. I usually just do them without it.
Yeah, when I was researching how to like the audio part of podcasting, and they said try and go everything external. So I got my Bluetooth earbuds on and the mic. So yeah, I like it. Everything sounds good, except I saw, I was telling, how we're doing Zoom right now, and there's a big push, like a big surge in Zoom surgeries where people see themselves and want to change how they look based on what they see on their Zoom. Have you read about that?
Oh no, I didn't hear that. No, that's a new one.
Yeah. They say plastic surgeons are getting a influx of patients who want to change because they don't look like how they look on Zoom. For
Wow, I'd
me,
really be. I look like No Neck Williams here all the time, slumped down on my couch. So I'd have to
yeah,
get a neck extension.
I'm the same way. I'm like, I'm not worried about how I look, but when I hear myself play back, I'm like, oh my God, I sound like that's for me, it's my voice. I think I sound nasally. I'm originally from upstate New York, so I probably have a little bit of that East Coast twang somewhere in me still.
Where are you? Where's upstate New York for you? It's such a big area. You know, people say upstate New
But
York, and
yeah,
it's like
yeah, Binghamton. I'm from
okay,
Binghamton. Yeah. It's a big hockey town. That's how I grew to love hockey because we had the Dusters and Roddy Bloomfield played Paul Newman's stunt double there and slap shot. And
yeah. Binghamton had an AHL team forever,
they still do.
and then oh, do they still? Because I know a lot of those New York teams, a lot of them eventually, Adirondack and Binghamton, and
Yeah.
those teams really started to struggle. Maine Mariners disappeared. A lot of those teams are
Yep.
gone. Uh,
Yeah. They went
Rochester still
through.
has it.
They had the Rangers, and then for a while the UHL. They had a team from the UHL, and then the Ottawa Senators came back. So they're the Binghamton Senators. They won the Calder Cup, and then now they are the Devils uh, farm team.
Right, because Devils were Albany for a long time, and then that, like I said, Albany and Adirondack, like a lot of those teams, Maine, a lot of that whole league eventually disappeared, unfortunately.
Yeah. So yeah, before I go on, everyone, I'm talking to Mike Boyle from Mike Boyle's Strength Conditioning. He's like a one of the foremost strength conditioning coaches in the country, and a lot of people consider you the father or pioneer, at least, of functional training. You've kind of incorporated from. We went from a lot of like growing up as a kid playing sports. It was all static stretching. Everyone gets in a big group and you bend over and touch your toes and do a few things here. And then as I got involved with strength conditioning, I started. Are you familiar with Doc Crease? He was at the University of
Oh
Colorado.
yeah, sure.
Yeah, I that's where I got my introduction to strength conditioning with Doc.
Now, where
And
was that? Because he was at like East Tennessee or something,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
yep, yeah. He went to from East Tennessee, I believe, and then he came to Boulder, and he was there for a while, and then went out to UCLA, and apparently now he's in really bad shape. He's got dementia, so he's
Oh,
not
that's
doing too
sad to
well.
hear. Yeah, a lot of, I
Yeah,
mean, we're getting old. I'm
yeah,
61, but a lot of those guys, when you think about the, Doc Crease's era, they're probably, I'm going to guess 75, 80, if I was looking at it.
yeah. So yeah, I learned from Doc, and that's where I got my introduction to Olympic lifting. And Doc was big on power clean snatches, bench, squat. And I had grown up with a bodybuilding. It was the Weider Muscle Fitness, and all those guys looked up to, and I never looked at just the basic, your extension movements like triple extension, all the ankle, knee, and hip. And that's where I started getting introduced to more like dynamic type warm ups. And then when I came back to Colorado to coach, they really had the dynamic warm up down, and a lot of it was based on stuff that introduced to the industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I tell this story all the time, but I guess I'm trying to think, probably in 2002 or three, Human Kinetics contacted me and said, I got at that time I might have actually gotten a letter. I don't even know if I was getting emails at that point in time, but it effectively said, we are going to, we want to do a book on functional training, and we think you'd be the ideal author. And so I contacted the acquisitions editor at that time, Ed, and I can't think of Ed's last name, not that it matters, but and I said, okay, how many people got that letter? How many people got the letter? Hey, we're going to do a book on functional training. We think you'd be the ideal author. And he was like, just you. And I was at that point, I was at Boston University. I was probably, I guess, in my 40s. And, I thought, wow, that's kind of cool, that these guys think that I could do this. But I said, I'm not sure I know what functional training is. And the editor said, well, we think what you do is functional training. And so my response was, so I'll write a book about what I do from a training perspective, and you'll call it functional training for sports. And he said, that's exactly what we're going to do. Yes. So in a way, I didn't think, like there was a very big discrepancy as far as what functional training was. Some people thought functional training at that point was standing on a stability ball. Some people thought functional training was standing on a balance disc and closing one eye. And some people thought it was waving dumbbells around all over the place. And we were in this process of discovering functional anatomy. And I hate to, it almost sounds dumb now, but we were just beginning to learn what the body really did. We had been taught what I would commonly refer to as dead person anatomy. So, dead person anatomy was like bicep flexes the elbow. Okay, great. Tricep extends the elbow. Okay, great. Like, the bodybuilding mentality that we, like you said, the weeder stuff, the stuff that we grew up with. And what we started to realize from guys like Gary Gray was that, wait a second, when the foot is on the ground, the muscles aren't doing what we were told they do. And that was an interesting thought process. I remember at that time I was working with Cam Neely was injured with the Bruins, and I was trying to really understand knee rehab, the current state of knee rehab. So I went to Gary Gray's chain reaction course, and the beginning of the course was really a primer on functional anatomy. And one of the things that Gary said was, forget all the anatomy you learned in college, because none of that stuff is true. And of course, everybody's sitting there going like, this guy's crazy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. But then he starts to explain it, and he said, think about this. He said, when you put your foot on the ground, running, moving from place to place, your foot touches down. He said, your quad isn't extending your knee. That doesn't make any sense. He said, your hamstring's not flexing your knee. That doesn't make any sense. He said, what does make sense is that all the muscles in your lower extremity are acting together to prevent flexion. They prevent, if they didn't work, you'd fall on the ground. You'd plant your foot and you'd crumble. But they don't. They all eccentrically work to decelerate flexion. And I remember sitting there thinking, wow, he's right. That's exactly what happens. And then he proceeds to move on. He said, basically, then when you push off, he said, all the muscles again do the same thing. They all initiate extension. He said, so, forget about, dorsiflexion and plantar flexion and knee flexion and leg extension and all that stuff, and start thinking about, I think the name of the course at that time was called When the Foot Hits the Ground. And basically the idea is that when the foot hits the ground, everything changes. Then you start getting into like the pelvis and, what's happening, what's a stabilizer, what's a neutralizer, what's happening when you're in single leg stance. And suddenly you're working your way up the body and you're realizing, wow, none of these muscles do what I thought they did. So you're literally relearning anatomy in a very real sense. And that made me change what we were doing from an exercise perspective, because suddenly as you're learning what the muscles do, you have this epiphany of, hey, it would be a really smart idea to have the muscles do in training what they do in real life. And that became for us this idea that other people said, oh, that's functional training. So I guess it was.
Yeah. Do you see now it's really been implemented? I mean, most of the people, bodybuilding is still kind of big, but you see more people really incorporating functional type exercises into their workouts. It's good, the core training and the warm ups. You still see, I mean, I still see people just, they're getting ready to run and they're just doing some little bend over stretches and you're just like, and I want to say something sometimes and you're just, they think they know what they're doing and they're doing something, but I always tell people, muscles like plastic, it's stiff when it's cold. And the more you bend it, the more pliable it becomes, and because you're adding heat to it. And it's the same with, I try and encourage people to do dynamic, at least do some kind of
Well, it's really funny, and I'll take it back a step and disagree with you. We static stretch before every workout because a muscle is like plastic, but at times what you're really looking for is what might be called plastic deformation. And the idea that we talk to people about is like if I had told you to put a trash bag over your hand and then told you to gradually try to push your hand through the trash bag, you would see that plastic deform. Before it actually tore, it would change. It would get thinner at that point in time. And for certain people that are trying to stretch, that may not be the worst thing to happen to them. So we basically foam roll and then we static stretch. And then we do dynamic warm up. So you might come in and look at our people now. But if you read Functional Training for Sports, the original 2004 version, I said exactly what you're saying. I said, don't static stretch ever. It reduces power. We want you to just do dynamic warm up. Over time, as we learned more, we came back around because one of the things, I'm a very big kind of cause and effect guy. And as players got injured, I would always kind of accompany them to their medical appointments, their rehab appointments, their physical therapy appointment, whatever it was, because I wanted to learn. I wanted to figure out, okay, what's actually going on here. And invariably during that no stretching time period, everybody that I brought to physical therapy or to a doctor was told something was too tight. Your hip flexors are too tight, your quads are too tight, your hamstrings are too tight, whatever it was. And they always recommended stretching. And I started to think, wait a second, if stretching is such a big deal for injury rehab, why aren't we doing it all the time? Why are we waiting for people to get hurt? So we've actually gone back. Like you might look at our initial warm up and think, oh, they're doing kind of a yoga based warm up. And we are. And it's very static. And I mean, I always say to people, I'm not really sure when you're stretching what is really happening. I don't know how much muscle you're actually lengthening. And I think now a lot of the stretching is probably more targeting the fascia, the denser parts of the muscle. And I always say to everybody, when you think about stretching, it's like, it would be like if I gave you a chicken breast, a defrosted chicken breast in a Ziploc bag. And I said, I need you to stretch the chicken breast out, but you can't take it out of the bag. After a couple of minutes, you probably would have really mauled the bag and not drastically changed the chicken breast very much. I think that's what we're feeling in stretching a lot of times is that we may be stretching, fascial areas, connective tissue areas, but we're trying to get what we really want is normal length. What's normal? I mean, there's certain ranges of motion that are considered normal. They say, hamstring flexibility. Okay, how high can I raise my leg? Well, if I can raise my leg somewhere between, 80 and 100 degrees of hip flexion, I'd probably be considered normal. If I'm under that, I'm subnormal. We don't want more. Like we don't want yoga type flexibility. We don't want dancer type flexibility because that becomes hypermobile. But we want mobile. We want people that can move well within their ranges. Because one of the things, and again, you kind of come from that old school background like me. The one thing that I noticed about people who weight trained aggressively in general is that they probably moved worse and worse.
Yeah.
The better they got. I always said, because I was a competitive powerlifter at one time, and I used to always say, if you went to a powerlifting meet, you didn't look around and think, wow, these guys are athletes. They're probably really good runners, jumpers, golfers, basketball players. You kind of looked at the guys and thought, these guys are really good at lifting weights.
Yeah.
And probably not very much else of anything. Whereas I went to an Olympic lifting meet. I went in the 80s, probably 80, somewhere between 82 and 84. The U.S. Nationals were in Seekonk, Massachusetts. Only time they've ever been in Massachusetts, I think, in the history of United States weightlifting. And we drove down to go, and I was so impressed by the Olympic lifters, by the way they looked, by the way they moved. They looked athletic, unlike the power lifters that I had been hanging around with.
They don't. When you see an Olympic lifter and you're like, what? And then you see how explosive and how strong they are, but they don't look it. Where you said like power lifters, you see them, and you're like, yeah, these guys are strong.
Yeah,
but Olympic lifters are surprisingly.
They're they're athletic looking. They look more along the lines. I can remember thinking, this is more what I want my athletes to look like. Yeah. And that's what, like I said, like Doc Kreese, everybody was really into Olympic lifting. I was really into Olympic lifting, but then it's like, to me, the functional training thing was the next logical extension of that, because what you really wanted people to look like were just, you knew what the best athletes looked like. You went to a track meet or an NFL camp or whatever, and you got I always remember oh my God, what was his name? The Dallas wide receiver, probably late 2000s. No, before him. Oh my God, I'm losing my mind. But I saw him playing basketball in LA, and even my wife looked at him. We were there at a health club in LA, and my wife was like, "Who is that?" And he was playing basketball with a bunch of NBA guys, and you could just tell, you were like, I don't know who that is, but he's really, really good at something. I'm not sure what that thing is that he's good at. At that time, you could have looked at him and thought maybe he's a, decathlete, maybe he's a sprinter. I don't know what he was, but he was a receiver for the Cowboys, whose name is totally escaping me right now. But it was not. It was pre-Des Bryant. It probably in the middle of the conversation will come to me, but that's all right.
Right. So what about, you talk about injuries and the source of injuries? Sometimes people misdiagnose, like sometimes you think you have a back pain where it could be associated really with your ankle or knees, and how do you deal with injuries as far as when you train someone? Because you still want them to be mobile and moving if possible. So how do you deal with injuries and injury prevention?
Well, I mean, I think that's what really led us to this whole functional training idea, really. I mean, for me, all of this emanated from injuries, from looking at guys getting hurt and figuring, okay, how do we make these guys better? And, again, a lot of the time we were going to seminars and listening to physical therapists talk. Like at that time, it was it was more like, for me, most of the learning that I was undergoing at that time was really related to physical therapy. It much more so than it would have been to strength and conditioning. I would say probably somewhere in the 90s, about the time I wrote my book, I had pretty much kind of given up on learning from other strength and conditioning coaches. It was just a matter of, hey, these guys, I guess the guy's name, it was Terrell Owens. Okay, thanks, good. I had to look at that. I apologize. Okay. Yeah, Terrell Owens. But, I was learning more from rehab professionals than I was learning from strength and conditioning professionals at that time, because I felt like, okay, I understand the powerlifting side of it. I understand how to get strong in the power lifts. I studied Olympic lifting really extensively. I understand how to get strong in the Olympic lifts. But now I need to look at these injuries and think, okay, if all of this that we were doing before was working the way that we thought it would, why are we having low back pain? Why are we seeing guys pull hamstrings? Why do guys pull their groins? Why are guys having hip surgeries? All these things that we were still seeing. And to me, all that stuff related back to what you were saying, looking at functional anatomy, that was where I came up with the joint by joint idea. I didn't really come up with it. I just copied it out of Greg Cook's head. But, we started to realize that ankle mobility was really drastically affecting knees, and that people with lousy ankle mobility were getting knee pain. Because if we think when people land on the ground, obviously the shock absorber initially is the ankle, right? That first movement is coming in the ankle and in the foot. If that ankle and foot are really, really stiff, maybe they've somebody who's been used to being heavily taped, wearing a high sneaker, wearing an ankle brace, they're throwing that force right up to their knee. And then we started to realize there was some people who were having, say, their hips weren't working the way that they were supposed to, and they were having knee pain, not hip pain. We started to realize that we were wasting a lot of time looking at the point of pain instead of looking at the cause of the pain. And the analogy I used at the time we started to talk about this stuff was, I said, you need to look on the roof. If you were in your house and there was a leak, and you were looking and saying, hey, there's water coming in my living room ceiling, logically in your mind, you would say right away, hey, I got a problem on my roof. I got a clogged gutter, or I got, loose flashing, whatever it is. But the way we behaved in the fitness and strength and conditioning world was, I always said it would have been like somebody coming in, you brought a guy in, he looked and he was like, I'll paint over the water stain, don't worry about it. And you would have been like, yeah, perfect. And he would have painted over the water stain. And then the next big rainstorm, you would have got the same thing. And he would have come back and painted it again. And you would have been paying him, month in and month out to paint over the water stain. And eventually your wall would have rotted out. And you would have thought, wow, I got a really big problem here. But you never went on the roof. You never unclogged the gutter. You never fixed the flashing.
We started
to look, source. We started to look at what is the source. And, that's where I started getting into Shirley Sarman stuff. Shirley Sarman is a genius physical therapist. And one of the things that she used to say is, anytime a muscle's injured, look for a weak synergist. And I started thinking, man, that fully explains hamstring strains. When you get people who don't have good glutes, they're going to pull a hamstring. And so we started to look, when someone had hamstring problems, we started looking at their glutes and thinking, okay, are they using their glutes? Are their glutes working, functioning? And then people started getting into the whole idea of muscles don't shut down, and they don't, but they can clearly be underactive. You can clearly see people who aren't using muscles as effectively as they should be. So we just started to look, and we weren't always right, but at least we were looking in the right places. We had the right thoughts, because for the longest time, strength and conditioning was the old, the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting results to change. That's what we did. Got a problem? Do more squats. A lot of squats didn't work. Well, let's do a real lot of squats then, because that'll definitely work. And you started to realize, I just got a guy who's, his back pain just got worse, and he's still got the hamstring problem that he had before. So it just was a gradual, I think, enlightening.
And one thing I noticed that you also do, and a lot of people take, well, he doesn't squat much, and you do more single joint, like single leg type movements and as opposed to doing, and I understand why, because you're not training Olympic lifters, you're not training power lifters, you're training athletes, even general public, because you're using you're pushing off of 1 foot or climbing stairs 1 step at a time. And so, but most people, when they hear that you don't squat, because that's a big thing, everyone, it's an ego thing for most guys, lift heavy squats. And so what's your philosophy? Like what made you go that route of using more single type movements, single leg movements?
So what made us go that way initially? Sorry, it's funny. I don't hear myself as well with the headphones on, but it sounds better. But what happened initially was back pain. We did a lot of back squatting, and I'd say this, I use, people who've heard me on other podcasts probably think he tells the same stories over and over again, which I do. But as a college strength coach, one of the things that I realized was that 10 to 20% of our athletes, and at this time, let's say primarily football, had active back pain, which means if we had a roster of 100, somewhere between 10 and 20 guys were not squatting due to back pain. And I used to look at that and think it's not acceptable that 10 to 20% of our athletes are not doing this lift, or in the reverse, that 10 to 20% of our athletes' backs are whatever, inflamed, irritated by this particular lift, because it was really, with everybody, it was squatting right across the board. And that was when we started to we started switching to front squats, and then we started to explore the unilateral alternatives. Initially, we did what everybody did. We tried leg presses, and, we bought a belt squat, and we kept doing bilateral stuff. But then, as I began to understand functional training, it started to make sense to me, one, that they're never pushing on two legs. I always say to everybody, rowing is the only sport that is consistently contested two legs at a time. That's it. One sport literally in the world. And so we started to look at that and then think, when guys did these unilateral alternatives, they didn't have back pain anymore. The other thing that we started to notice was that guys liked the unilateral stuff because it made sense to them. The only people who didn't like it tended to be the football linemen, because they had been so ingrained in the idea that their value to the team was directly related to how much they could back squat. But everybody else, when you started to explain to them, like, wait a second, we can get you just as strong with a lot less weight when we do things on one leg. And there's the added benefit, functionally, core, pelvis, specificity to cutting, to direction change. There's so many things that made so much more sense about being on one leg. And gradually over time, I just kept kind of going more and more in that direction, realizing that I just kind of felt like, wow, this bilateral stuff is kind of dumb. And it was the classic, if you ask people, why do you do it? The answer would always be either, well, that's the way we always did it, or that's the way my high school coach did it, or that's the way the guy who taught me about lifting did it. There was never a logical scientific explanation for why you did it. And then what we started to do is as you explore the science of it, you realize, wait a second, this doesn't really make sense at all, because we were handling more weight. And even last year, this is what I love about this. Last year, I ran across some research from a guy named Alex Natera. Alex is I believe, an Australian rules football strength coach. And he had been at Aspire Academy, which is in Doha. And he had done a paper for the NSCA, the UK NSCA conference. And it came through to me in a very roundabout way through a personal trainer in England. But when I looked at the paper, what Natera had done is he had looked at force plate studies of back squat versus one leg squat. And what he was trying to figure out was, what is the weight in one leg squat and how does that weight relate to two leg back squat? And so this is really cool. I don't know if you've read Range by David Epstein, but David Epstein's book, Range, Epstein talks about something he calls undiscovered connections. And the idea that there are always going to be undiscovered connections of one field to another. So the initial study that Natera references is on airline pilots, or actually military pilots. And what he's trying to what they're studying is what's the weight in the seat of the plane. And what they determine is that the weight in the seat of the plane is equal to 68% of your body weight. So effectively, your torso, your arms, and your head are count for 68% of your body weight. That meant that your legs were 32%. So what he said is that means that when I do a true one leg squat, stand on one leg, do a one leg squat, I am now one leg squatting 84% of my body weight. My initial load before I add any weight to it is 84% of my body weight. The 68 plus the 16 or 68 and 16. 68 for the torso and 16 for one leg, 84%. Then they started doing these force plate studies. And basically what they realized is that at the point when you could one leg squat 50% of your body weight. So let's just make it simple. For instance, I weigh 200. When I can do a one leg squat with 100 pounds, pure one leg squat, whether, I might be goblet loading 100 pounds, I might have dumbbells in my hands, weight vest, whatever it is, that makes me a double body weight back squatter. And they match that up with force plate information. And so now you look at it and think, wait a second, I can have an athlete with 100 pounds of external load, and that's going to match 400 pounds of external load. That's a really good trade-off when you're thinking about, the term that I kind of coined a few months ago was the idea of orthopedic cost. What's the orthopedic cost of an exercise? Like what do you pay for doing it? Like with back squats, there's an orthopedic cost, and that orthopedic cost tends to be spinal, right? I don't know anybody from squatting who had problems with their knees. I don't know anybody from squatting who had problems with their back. I know a lot of people from squatting. Had problems with their hips, but I know lots of people who had problems with their back. The orthopedic cost is wear and tear, whether it's SI joint, L5, S1, whatever it is, it beats up your back. So now I can take that load and effectively reduce it by 75%. I could bring it from 400. Actually, I can reduce it really not 75, 300%. I can bring it from 400 down to 100 and get the same benefit. And then I can take that benefit and make it more functional, because now I've added in, pelvic stabilizers, all of these other things that are going to be part of the equation. I was like, why would anybody still do, I look at it now and think, why does anybody do bilateral stuff? The people who still do bilateral stuff, to me, are just not doing their homework. They're not doing the research necessary to look at this, because if they really looked at it, they would be where I am and think, I don't know why anybody does it.
Yeah. And I'm glad you went into that, because one of the things now, like for myself, I play hockey off and on, but I still train, and I've always tried to incorporate training that is relevant to what I'm doing. And a big thing now, I don't know if you ever heard the term hunter athlete. And so a lot of us go to the backcountry, like up in the Rocky Mountains, to hunt elk and big game. And, carrying out an elk is not an easy process once you get one. And a lot of it involves, low back stability. And then, you're carrying a backpack with 100 pounds. So you want to have strong legs. And it makes more sense to do single leg movements for that case, because you got to carry up and down hills as opposed to, like bilateral. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because, I follow a lot of guys on Instagram. I'm sure you've seen videos of people working out, and they're always doing squats. And I rarely see guys doing single leg movements. It's always squats, and hey, look at me, I'm squatting, look how deep I get. And that's great. Congratulations. But, I think you're going to get more benefit, as you said, producing that force and be able to carry that weight up and down hills and over rocks and everything with stronger leg exercises. You're doing single joint movements. Yeah.
Yeah. Without question, single leg exercises. And that's what I mean. And just, when you relate that, never mind, what, like you said, bringing, meat out of the backcountry, but look at every sport, watch every sport.
Every sport.
You don't see double leg action. And I said, when you really understand American football, talk to a great American offensive line coach, it's all about steps. Yep. It's all about stepping. You don't the old days, you used to, fire out at the guy, you drive off 2 legs. No one teaches that anymore. It's all unilateral. And the guys, again, who are the best linemen? The great athletes. Who are the best linemen? The best sprinters. Because they can move in this unilateral way. And again, we found it's really funny. The guys who really appreciate our approach in the football world are like the offensive tackles. Big guys that are 6'7", 6'8", with a lot of body weight. And they've just been forced by their coaches for years and years to put way too much weight on their back. Yep. And it doesn't fit their frame. I did a podcast actually a couple days ago, and I always jokingly say the people that encourage you to squat are what I would call squatty looking. The guy who's a good squatter, yeah, exactly. He's usually 5'6", 5'7", 5'8". He's upwards of 200 pounds. He's got really
big.
Yeah. And he's got very, dimensionally, he's very similar, in terms of torso to leg length and all that stuff. And then you take the average NFL offensive tackle and you realize, wow, this guy's all legs and arms. and he's 6'7" and he's 315 pounds and he doesn't have great strength to body weight ratio. And he's just got a lot of negatives going against him from a physics standpoint. And then the little squatty guy is just trying to jam that square peg in the round hole as hard as he can, because it's like, all they're saying, all the strength coach a lot of times is saying is, I want to make you like me. I want to make you like what I like. I want to make you do what I do.
Yeah.
Instead of looking at it and thinking, we look at it and say, I want to make you the best player that you can be. I want to keep you as healthy as I possibly can. And that made me, we had a guy named Gauze DeCharlis who just retired a couple of years ago. I think he played 13 years between Detroit, Indianapolis, and Tampa Bay. But, he didn't, excuse me, he didn't do a heavy squat the last 10 years of his career, probably. And we did all unilateral stuff with him, and he was a very productive player for a really long period of time. And he was able to stay healthy. He had some knee problems, but he was able to come back from from a microfracture surgery. And a lot of it, I think, related to the unilateral stuff that we did.
I think you just also left out someone who just is 43 years old and just won a Super Bowl that doesn't incorporate. I mean, his training methods are supposed to be like, people like, really?
Yeah, but that's, I don't want to go too far with that, because he's changed. And I believe a lot of the change has been marketing related.
Okay.
Because he wants to sell the system. Yeah. Because he started out as a much more conventional guy. When you look at his body at his draft picture, in the NFL draft, and that picture has been well circulated. He was in a really good, his initial strength coach in New England was my original mentor, Mike
Johnny
Woysick.
Parker, right? Oh, Woysick.
Oh, okay. Before Johnny, it was Mike Woysick. Right after, he was right in that transition. And someone said, I didn't realize Mike's first year and Brady's first year were the same first year. And Brady trained in a very conventional way. Probably, if he's 43, I would say at least the first 10 to 12 years, he trained in a pretty conventional manner, lifting weights and running sprints. And then as he got old, he became this like, oh, I only do bands and stretching. And the reality is, when you're a 43-year-old who's really developed their game, you probably can get away with that.
Yeah.
But I don't believe he ever would have gotten to where he is right now. Like, that's one thing I always talk about is I think there's a lot of young quarterbacks who aren't going to get better because they're looking at what Tom Brady is doing and thinking, oh, I'm not lifting weights. I'm just going to do band stuff and stretch. Those kids will not become NFL quarterbacks because, they're not looking at, Brady from whatever, 22 to, 32 or 22 to 34 or 35 or whatever it was, and seeing what he did. They're only seeing the end product of a guy who, was pretty dialed in his old age.
Well, then you said, but it works for him because he's selling the system. So he's getting all these people on
right.
On
and
board.
It's very, very marketing driven in my mind. I don't believe it's, I think it's a little bit disingenuous, to be truthful.
Now, one thing you mentioned too, is you talked about linemen and sprinters. And this goes to the question of, whenever someone asks me about cardio, and I always incorporate, okay, listen, if you look at a marathoner, they're very, they're lean, but if you try to get them lift heavy weights, they can't because their body's not made for that. Whereas you look at a sprinters probably have one of the most, if you were an artist and you were chiseling marble and you wanted one of the perfect physiques, would be a sprinter. And they got super lean and were able to keep on mass by the type of training. All their weightlifting and their running are all incorporated, right? They're both interval, very explosive, so they can burn that body fat, stay super lean, and stay muscular. And as far as like cardio training, do you encourage one over the other, like as far as endurance versus
Oh
intervals?
yeah, in all honesty, I don't even like the word cardio training. If we're talking about athletes, if we're talking about you and me, average general population folks, even that I'm a big interval proponent, but I can at least think of, the heart becomes a concern for the athlete. I'm not really worried about cardio or the heart. I'm worried about, I would look at it much more as game specific or position specific conditioning. And for us with our athletes, it's almost 100% interval in nature. We never jog ever. Like, I don't believe we don't jog the warm up. We don't jog. We're either, we basically, I kind of joke, we either walk or we sprint. We either walk or we run. And we never run distances. Like, we would never, I can't tell you the last time I had an athlete run for continuously. If someone ran continuously for a minute, that would be very, very long for us. Even for our hockey guys, it would be, a minute would be the long end of any type of interval that we were going to do. So we are very, very clearly interval training people.
That's where I got introduced to. I did an internship with. Do you remember Doug McKinney with the Buffalo Sabres?
Yeah. Doug went to Springfield College with me. We've been friends. We've been friends for over 40 years.
That's where I was introduced to the interval training and using the heart rate monitor, and because he had a lot, all his guys just did sprints, every single one, and I was amazed.
He just got hired by Indianapolis, actually. Today it was in the paper.
The Colts,
yeah. Because
no shit.
Rusty Jones. So
because he was with the Bills.
Rusty and Doug went to the same high school in New Hampshire.
Oh, okay.
And Rusty actually coached Doug in high school and then coached him at Springfield College. And they've been tight ever since. So he was just in the paper today. He just got hired as like their assistant strength coach / sports science guy.
Oh, no shit. Yeah, because when I was with him, and one thing that amazed me about hockey players is they would go out and play 60 minutes, and then right after the game, they're in there doing working out. And I'm like, I never saw athletes do that ever until hockey. And they loved it. And so, but Doug got me introduced to the whole interval training. And I've always, and then, like I said, you see the results. Just look at sprinters. You want to see interval training at its best? Just look at like someone does a 100-meter sprint or 200 meters. They're just jacked.
Yeah.
And I think people more nowadays are, like I said, you go to Instagram too, and you see people just run, and they're encourage people to run. That's great getting outside. But I think if your goal is to, physique wise, look as perfect as you can, interval training is the way to go. So, and speaking of training, overtraining, because a lot of people tend to not, majority of people going to a gym are just there going with the flow and never really have a plan and don't follow a plan. And then they run into injuries and overtraining because they just think they have to be there for 2-3 hours where you can get it knocked out in half an hour, 45 minutes. So, like, as far as overtraining, what is your like?
Well, one for us, we're very specific about like our professional athletes. We ask them to train about 8 hours a week. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 hours a day, 4 times a week. And we don't, we discourage extra work. I mean, I think some people would be like, you discourage extra work? I'm like, yeah, I discourage extra work. I just did an Instagram post this morning about that. And the gist of the post is that training in its simplest sense is basic biology. Stimulus response. Training is a stimulus. But what matters is the response. If you have too much stimulus and not enough response, you don't get better. And generally, you're better off with too little stimulus than opposed to too much. So we have espoused the idea of what we would call the minimum effective dose. What's the least you can do to get the benefit that we want, as opposed to what's the most you can tolerate? And for years in sports, everything in sports was kind of about the mental toughness factor and how hard could you work and the grind and all. I think we've begun to realize that really doesn't work and really doesn't matter. So we're taking a much more minimalist approach. We do less conditioning than we've ever done, to be honest. It's for us, maybe 15 minutes a day, it would be considered a pretty good hard conditioning workout for us. And like my son and his friends who are high school athletes, we do no conditioning at all, zero. It's very rare that we condition because we find that they tend to practice or play somewhere between like 4 and 6 times a week, depending on what point of their season they're in. We can have kids like my son plays hockey and plays lacrosse during lacrosse season, they can have 2 nights of practice, and then they could in some weekend tournaments play 4 or 5 games on the weekend. Those kids don't need to run. They don't need extra running. They probably need to recover from that Saturday, Sunday, 4 to 5 game thing. And I think this is why we still see so many young athletes with overuse injuries. So we need to we need to kind of focus in on this idea that maybe less is more.
Right. Their whole rest, recovery and rest is where things happen. That's where your body makes the gains.
Right.
Feeding
exactly.
it and
resting it. The response time is what matters.
And then another thing I've always looked at is like when you see people train, a lot of people train because they see themselves in the mirror here and then neglect the backside. You'll see guys with a big chest and the arms pulled forward, but they don't focus on that backside. And I like some of the exercises you incorporate where now, is there a reason why, like when you do pull downs, you cross? Is that
because when you
the shoulder?
When you think about it, your arm, I always say your arm is a spiral diagonal joint. It wants to move across your body, sort of from internal rotation to external rotation. It's a very natural movement when you cross. And even, when we do, ring rows or TRX rows, we'll encourage somebody to move from internal rotation to external rotation because that's the way the joint works. And again, when you think about like in the old days, the bar, like you hooked the bar to your machine and the bar told you what you could do.
Exactly.
You couldn't bend the bar. You couldn't curl the bar. The bar was the bar. And we got very used to the idea, even with I wrote an article last month about why we've moved away from bars. And really we do cleans, hand cleans with a bar. We bench press with a bar and we don't really do anything else. Because in general, I'd much rather be using dumbbells. I'd much rather, be unilateral. I'd much rather have somebody be kind of self-selecting the kind of proper joint path for themselves rather than having that be determined by the bar. So I think there's a lot that we still can learn about training. I'll put it that way.
So, and that's another thing I'm glad you covered and I asked is because a lot of guys who will be listening to this are archers. And the way you demonstrate and you guys do pull downs makes more sense for an archer because that plane, that rotation of the shoulder and everything pulling is in that same plane. There's another guy I interviewed. I don't know if you heard him. His name's Christian Williams. He's got a program called Archery Strong. And he's like you. He does training for archers. And he's got some really good methods that he uses, incorporates with his for archers. But I think he'll benefit from seeing what you do as well and maybe incorporate some of that stuff because I love watching your videos and exercises that you do because they all make sense. To me, they make sense. They're not bodybuilding exercises and they're movements that are going to benefit you or in the long term.
I mean, as I've saw, if you read sort of the initial part of functional training for sports, we talk about the idea that functional training is training that makes sense. That's basically, the premise is that we're looking at this and thinking, okay, this makes sense. This is logical. And that's really what we need is more logic.
Do you think guys, and not guys, I use the term loosely, when they train a lot of people, like I said, focus on the legs, the squats, hamstrings. Do you think, I was always told, I was taught if you're going to do one extension exercise, the flexion, the hamstring, you should do 2. So, because everyone focuses on that front part. So you want to keep your hamstrings. Because hamstrings play a big part in the overall, like your knee strength, everything. So,
I think for us, one, anytime you do, like if you're doing a squatting exercise, you're actually working your hamstrings anyway, because again, right. You can't, they're always part of the motion. If you're doing things, say non-leg extension, non-leg curl, so anything where you're in standing, you're getting the co-contraction effect of your hamstrings, which is going to be a benefit. But for us, we kind of look at knee dominant, hip dominant, and knee dominant would be squats and things that look like squats, and hip dominant would be everything else, like forward bending type exercises, slide board leg curl. We tend to be in that 2-to-1 because we look at things like sort of bridge variations, slide board leg curl, what some people would call Nordics, although I don't love that name. One leg, straight leg deadlift. There's a lot of more versions of the hip dominant pattern than there are of the knee dominant pattern. So for us, yeah, we're probably always 2-to-1 posterior chain to anterior chain. And we're trying to hit a lot of different angles because, again, in the posterior chain, those muscles are doing a lot of different things. They're assisting in hip extension, like in sprinting and in jumping. And with the hamstrings, they're controlling the swing leg as you swing through that phase. There's just a lot more going on in the posterior chain than the anterior chain.
I got a couple of questions here. I reached out to some friends that are still in the industry, and one of them, she did an internship with you in 2002. You remember Sarah Ramey?
Oh yeah. How do you know Sarah?
We coached together at Colorado.
Oh, that's right. She was at Colorado before she was at whatever Texas directional school she's at.
Yeah, she went to Kansas State, and then from Kansas State to Colorado. Yeah, she's at West Texas A&M.
West Texas, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, we still keep in touch. I see her all the time when I go out west. I always stop in because it's like a 7-hour drive there. So I'll crash for the night and then head up to the mountains after that.
Yeah.
So here's her question.
She's
her question
great.
Is, where do you see the progression of the industry going in the next 10 years for strength conditioning?
I think the functional training thing will continue to move forward. I think you'll also see, as much as I don't want to see it, I think you'll see a lot more sports science because I think the administrative people in college and the management people in pro sports are fascinated with, catapult and things like that. So I think I always tell everybody, if you're going to be involved in strength and conditioning, you need to become adept at heart rate monitor systems and at catapult and a lot of these things, because whether you want to use them or not, if you don't know how to use them, you're going to be considered inadequate and unprepared. So I think that's a big thing. But as I said, I also think functional training, I think, the Mike Boyle ideas, the Exos ideas, those types of things are going to become more and more prevalent. I think you'll probably eventually get to the point where the dinosaurs will be left pretty much in American football, and that's it. And even the American football guys are evolving, are getting better over time. But I think they'll be they're the kind of slow-moving glacier of our strength and conditioning field.
It's funny.
So
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
It's funny you mentioned slow-moving glacier, because I remember when I was in the military and I was in Afghanistan, I reached out to you and you were generous. You sent us some TRX, some med ball stuff, just simple things we could use up at base. And it got me thinking as I was getting ready to do this interview with you, how the military training has, when I talk about dinosaur, when I was in basic training, and this is 20 years ago, not less than 20 years ago, and just up to recently, everything was push-ups, sit-up, your basic, which are fine, and a 2-mile run. Now they completely revamped to more functional type physical fitness test, but it took them almost, I don't know how, probably 50, 60 years to.
I was going to say that, when was the American Revolution?
Right. I was going to say 100 some years, but I don't know if they did all that back then. But yeah, it's just so funny how it takes so long but they're finally, it's good to see that they're incorporating all that stuff.
Yep. The military, what's happening, one of the reasons the military changed is because of the amount of money they were spending on their special ops guys. Those guys, not that they were paying them the money, but the money that was being spent on them made them like professional athletes. You had these elite, and because I first got involved in this maybe 15 years ago now, but because CrossFit was getting big, and there was a concern in the medical community, the military medical community, that, hey, CrossFit, this is the wrong idea. And we got involved in trying to talk about that. We went down to the SOMA meetings, which is Special Operations Medical Association. And at SOMA, you have like, SAS people and, the Rangers people and the SEALs people from all over the world are all coming together to talk about a lot of it medical, but some of that now is beginning to relate to fitness. And we ended up down there, Mark Verstegen, myself, and Greg Cook. And I think Mark Twite was his name. That was the guy who trained the people for 300 for the movie. He was one of the original CrossFit guys, to discuss sort of the CrossFit phenomenon. But the military CrossFit, I think, helped the military evolution, to be honest, because it got them into more of the functional fitness, functional training idea. We're going to do Olympic lifts. We're going to do multi-joint lifts. We're going to do plyometrics. We're going to do gymnastics, bodyweight stuff. A lot of the pieces of CrossFit are very good when you look at the pieces.
Yeah.
It's when you look at it executed that you go like, ooh, I didn't like how that looked in the end. But the idea was really good, because you think about it, interval training, Olympic lifting, plyometrics, multi-joint strength training, all great stuff. And now what the military has done, as you know, is they've hired qualified strength and conditioning people for nearly every unit. So everybody, or the vast majority, now have a strength coach.
Yeah, I know that.
Like a pro sports team or like a college team. So it's great.
Yeah, I know that Paul Goldberg, who was with the Avs, I helped him out for preseason one year. I know he's, I guess he's with Fort Carson. I guess they hired him for their special ops guys or something down there.
He's another good guy.
Yeah, he was
an original NHLer.
Yeah, he was a cool dude. And then I think maybe I'll save the CrossFit. Maybe we'll talk about maybe another podcast together, because that's a whole rabbit hole.
Yeah, that's another whole can of worms. Say, I got to get out of here. So if you got one more question, I'd love to answer that for you. And then I got to.
Quick one from Vern Stevens. He used to be with the Raiders. Now he's and then the Cardinals stuff. He just wants to know if any transition he's seen with how pro athletes spend their off-season training.
Yeah, I think that's getting worse. I think the NFL getting away from more organized OTAs has not been good for the players, because the players tend to end up with people who want to train them, not who should be training them. And the guys will tend to go somewhere where maybe they like the guy, or they like the gym, or they like the girls at the gym, or whatever it is, but not necessarily to the best places. Mm-hmm. And it's funny, I have a friend who just is going, this year will be his first year in the NFL. And that was the one thing that I said to him, was that the way the off-season activities have gone now for NFL players, if I was an NFL strength coach, my number one priority would be figuring out where these guys are in the off-season, knowing who they're with, vetting the places that they're at, and saying, okay, I know these people, I know their philosophy, I know how their facility is run, and I'd be comfortable. That's why when I was with the Red Sox, I spent a lot of time trying to find places for guys to train, because I found, we had guys making $10 million a year, and they were picking the place to work out based on what was closest to their house. Literally, I had one guy who, after he made a change, he probably made $50 million after he made this change. But I used to say, like, why do you go there? And he said, actually, well, my wife goes there, and it's really close to our house. So it makes it easy, like for my wife, for babysitting. And I said, so you just go there because it's close to your house. And I said, do you think the guy is good? And he goes, not really. I think he makes most of the workouts up right on the spot, right while I get there. And I'm thinking, we got a guy who's making millions of dollars, but he's made his decision of where to train based on where his wife works out and where it is in relation to his house in the off season. That's the kind of stuff that you run into in pro sports that you can't let happen. You have to find, guys like, okay, I'm going to send them to guys like me, or I'm going to send them to an exo facility. I'm going to send them somewhere where I'm comfortable that they will be doing things that I want them to do in a way that I want them to do them.
All right. Well, and then lastly, I got one of your pro J's coming on here. We're just working out the details. Lindsay Fry, remember her?
Oh, really? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Lindsay's a wonderful kid.
What's funny about her? I heard you do a podcast and you talked about the girl who won the U.S. Open. Her mother was a swimmer at BU when you were there. Mm-hmm. And I coached Lindsay probably about 15 years ago. Just her mom hired me and her and her brother and a couple neighbor kids, and I was doing like speed and agility drill stuff with them. And I didn't realize at the time, and also 2014 Olympics, I'm like, what? Wait. And I start, and it's her playing for the team and stuff. And then, so yeah, we reconnected. So yeah, we're working on it, trying to get her on the podcast. I know she's with the Cardinal or Coyotes and
Yeah. Yeah, it was
doing the radio gig and stuff.
Sloane Stevens, who I've never met, but her mom was a woman named Sybil Smith, who was a swimmer at BU. And I just recognized the mom. She was talking about her mom and how much her mom had done for her. And I look at the woman in the stands and I'm like, oh my God, that's Sybil Smith. Like, she looked exactly the same. And she's probably in her 50s now, but still, very, beautiful, athletic woman.
Yeah.
And obviously the husband, the father, was an NFL player for the Patriots who unfortunately died in a car crash. But the kid got a great genetic package in terms of, dad was an NFL running back and mom was a All-American swimmer. So it's a pretty good package. And the kid ends up a tennis player.
Yeah, I could tell when I met Lindsay, she was like 14 at the time. I was like, this girl, there's something different about her. So yeah.
She's pretty athletic.
Yeah. Well, Mike, listen, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. Taking your time out to speak with me. It's a great pleasure to have you on this podcast.
Well, it was a pleasure to be here. I'm going to cut out because I gotta get back to work.
Roger. See you, Mike.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.